Okay, hello, good morning, everyone. Thanks for being with us. My name is Brian Campbell, and I'm the Director for the Bureau of Curriculum, Assessment, and Instruction at the department. And with me today is our core team that has been working on the implementation of Act 158, which is the state graduation requirements. And on that team, we've got Rich Marichello and Brian Truesdale from PDE's Division of Assessment and Accountability. We've got two of our PDE content advisors, Laura Friederici and Rebecca Baum-Lehman. And we've got Amy Monroe and Jean Deisel with us, who work in PDE curriculum and who work on the SAS website. So we've got a good group of folks with you as we move forward and talk about implementing and reporting on graduation requirements in the coming year. What we want to do today, our goal today is to talk about, give you a quick overview of the requirement, but start to move beyond just talking about the actual definitions associated with implementing Act 158 and get to some of the reporting and some of the things that will come down for folks as we start to implement the graduation requirements and what some of the local and state reporting will look like as we move forward with this. So I want to give you some quick background. We want to talk about the pathways. That word becomes very important. And some of the other provisions that your LEA will have to track in order to certify graduates starting with the class of 2023. We want to talk about the toolkit and some of the future trainings that PDE are going to provide to you to help you in this as you move forward with the graduation requirement. And then we are going to, as we said, talk about the local and the state reporting and how that's actually going to look and some of the things that you will be responsible for moving forward as you certify graduates. And then, of course, we'll have the opportunity to take some questions. If you remember, Act 158 was established, the purpose was to reduce the amount of emphasis on the state testing requirement. And at the time we had the project-based assessment as pretty much the sole pathways to graduation. What we wanted to look at was some alternate ways in which students could show the readiness for post-secondary, for career, for community preparedness, and those things that outside of that testing system. So we had begun the implementation of Act 158 over the last 2 years, but much as everything else in our world, the pandemic has had an effect. And Act 136 of 2020 has some changes to the graduation requirement. The most significant of which is that we've extended the timeline for implementation to the graduating class of 22-23. So your current 10th graders are the first class that will graduate under a statewide graduation requirement. This extended your local graduation policy. So your current 12th and 11th graders will graduate under your locally board-approved graduation requirement. Students who take a Keystone course in the year in which the state testing requirements were waived are deemed proficient for the purpose of graduation only, provided that they meet the locally established grade-based requirement. And that word's used a lot, and quite honestly, that really is in 99% of the cases, that really is your trigger course, okay? So in the year in which testing was waived, school year 1920, a student who was enrolled in a trigger course and passed that trigger course and is in the graduation cohort of 22-23 or beyond, does receive a proficient for the purpose of graduation only. There still may or may not be reasons that that student needs to retest for other purposes such as accountability. It also provides the secretary with the authority to waive NACDIA and NIMS assessments when appropriate. So we do know that there have been NACDIA and NIMS assessments waived both in 1920 and the possibility some will be waived in 2021. And that could also affect students in the career and technical education pathway. The first thing we also want to let you know is there are a group of students who will graduate both under your local assessment policies and then again under Act 158 that are not necessarily enrolled in these pathways. One of those are students with an IEP who will graduate based upon their academic goals. So there are a number of students, they're primarily takers of the PASA, the alternate assessment, but that isn't always the case. These may be PSSA or Keystone takers as well, who through their IEP and IEP team decisions have established a graduation pathway upon academic goals. Those students do not fit one of the 5 pathways, but can be deemed a graduate. Additionally, there is a waiver for students with extenuating circumstances, the superintendent's waiver. Most often those are medical emergencies, family emergencies in the senior year. It is students who transfer in the senior year, but there are some extenuating circumstances in which a student cannot complete a pathway, which the requirement may be waived by the superintendent or chief academic officer. The important thing to remember about the waiver is that if 5% of a graduating class, if you exceed 5% of the class using the waiver in consecutive years, it does lead to a PDE audit, the potential for an audit, and the establishment of an improvement plan. Okay, so we are talking about special circumstances, and that really shouldn't exceed 5% of a graduating class. There's also some consideration for our English language learners and our non-native speakers. Some of our students with whom English is a second language that participate in WIDA. There are some accommodations throughout the pathways for our EL students. And one of those is to remember that there are EL students who do not take the ELA state assessment. And that is typically a student in their first year. So an EL is registered in their first year, an EL student, and they're scheduled to take the ELA exam. They do not. So those students do not have some of the Keystone scores that are necessary when we reference some of these pathways. So it's important to make accommodations, and then most of those students will go through either the alternative assessment pathway or most likely the evidence-based pathway. So there are 5 total pathways, but I want to break it into 2 parts. The first part I would really like to talk about is pathway 1 and 2. If you look at the order they're in the bill, but we would prefer to title them, and that's the proficiency pathway and the composite score pathway. Both of these pathways are reliant on state assessment scores. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them because they're really pretty easy to figure out and pretty self-explanatory. But the proficiency pathway, and so this is the first pathway which with a student can graduate. The proficiency pathway is for students who score proficient or advanced on each of the 3 required Keystone exams: Algebra 1, Literature, and Biology. Okay. It's important to remember the scaled score for proficiency, the minimum score is a 1500. About 2/3 of our students, okay, a little over 60% of our students over the last 3 years would have fit into this pathway. So this is the student who is proficient or advanced on 3 of their Keystones, the 3 Keystones. That's automatic. The second pathway is the composite pathway. So this is earning a satisfactory composite score on the 3 keystones: algebra, and literature, and biology. And what we're looking at here is a student who may be, particularly strong in 1 or 2 academic areas, and maybe just, just missing the cut, so to speak, on another of those areas. So this is kind of an overall balanced approach to your keystone scores, where an area of strength may mitigate an area of some weakness. So to qualify for this pathway, the student must achieve at least 1 proficient score on one of the 3 exams. So they must score proficient or advanced on at least 1 of the 3 exams, and no less than basic on the remaining 2. So a student with a below basic score is not eligible for this pathway. And a student must have at least 1 proficient score to be eligible for this pathway. Once the student meets that profile, if their composite scaled scores meet or exceed 4452, the student is eligible for graduation. This encompasses, over the last 3 years, roughly about 12 to 15% of the students who were not proficient on 3 keystones, but were proficient on at least 1 and able to use this pathway. So as we said earlier, the purpose of Act 158 was to establish some pathways and some possibilities for graduation that were not reliant on the keystone scores. So the first 2 pathways are, the 3 additional pathways are not. And those are the career and technical pathway, the alternative assessment pathway, and the evidence-based pathway, okay? While they are not dependent on keystone scores, we do know that those courses, Algebra 1, English Literature, and Biology, represent the minimum academic requirement in Chapter 4. Okay, so those are the minimum academic requirement. So while a student need not be proficient on their keystones to meet those requirements, they do need to meet successful completion of a local grade-based requirement. They do need to demonstrate some level of proficiency in those 3 subjects. So to qualify for one of the 3 alternate pathways, the student must pass the 3 keystone trigger courses. Okay, so the assessment pathways, the proficiency pathway or the composite score, as long as the student achieves the required scaled scores, their performance in the local trigger class doesn't necessarily matter. In this case, if they do not demonstrate mastery through the keystone exam, then their performance in the local trigger course is necessary for them to qualify for one of the 3 remaining options. First option we'll talk about in the 3 pathways tied to the local trigger course is the career and technical education pathway. So this is for a student who is established as a completer in a certified career and tech ed program. So it requires successful completion of the locally established grade-based requirement for each keystone exam in the content area where the student was less than proficient. Okay, so they either pass their keystone or pass the trigger course in that area. And then they either attain an industry-based competency certification related to their concentrator program. So this is the students who complete a program, most likely pass a NOCTI or NIMS, although there's not a NOCTI associated with every program, and then achieve their certification, or demonstrate a high likelihood of success in an improved competency program where the readiness for continued meaningful engagement in the concentrators program is studied. That or is in there for the students who will either, 1, participate in a program for which there is not a NOCTI, okay? And there are guidelines inside of each program that define the likelihood of success. And that is also a relevant pathway for the students for whom the NACDIA and NIMS have been waived through the Act 136. So this is a student who is proficient on their trigger courses and has either attained their certification working through the concentrator program as a completer, or has completed the certified program and still has post-secondary opportunities to attain that certificate. Whoops. The alternate assessment pathway. This is the second of the alternative pathways, the pathways not reliant necessarily on Keystone scores. And again, you'll see that language at the top of the slide. Just as a reminder, this is a student who will have to meet the locally grade-based established requirements of the Keystone content areas. So passing the 3 trigger courses or any trigger course that they did not receive a proficient score in. In addition to that, much like the CTE, had an addition to the locally based requirement. This is the attainment of an established score on an approved alternative assessment. The alternative assessments that were listed right in the Act include the SAT, the PSAT, or the ACT, the Work Keys exam, an advanced placement or IB test and coursework, or the ASVAB, the Armed Service Vocational Battery.
Brian?
There is also the ability to complete a pre-apprenticeship program or acceptance into an accredited 4-year nonprofit institution of higher education.
Brian?
Yes, Jean.
I'm sorry. We have a question here from Sarah who says, have the established scores been determined yet? And then also another question, will we be able to receive this PowerPoint?
So the established scores have been determined. And I believe the PowerPoint will be available. I'm not, I'll have to check back with the moderators and folks on how that happens. I'm not necessarily opposed. So we'll make that work out for folks, but the scores have been approved and are available here. So there are 2 types of scores here and 2 things to be aware of. The SAT, PSAT, ACT, and ASVAB and Work Keys. The set of exams listed there. Meeting the approved cut score for any of these exams is meets the qualifications for graduation. Okay, because these are tests in multiple subject areas. So as long as a student has met the cut score, so to speak, for the SAT, PSAT, ACT, ASVAB, Work Keys, and pass their trigger courses, that student is eligible for graduation. You see them there. The SAT is 1010, PSAT is 970, 21 on the ACT, and 31 on the ASVAB. Although right now it is a 31, the language is actually that it is the minimum score to qualify for placement into one of the branches of the U.S. military. That is updated on occasion, change website and things. But right now and over the last few years, that score has maintained steadily at 31. Also is the Work Keys gold level, and that was written right into Act 158, that would be the established score. An AP or IB test and coursework may be used to replace a Keystone exam in the alternative assessment pathway. But what's important to remember here is that the AP or IB course must meet the academic content area associated with the Keystone exam on which the student was not proficient. So whereas a student could have truly achieved, one proficient score or even no proficient scores, I'm not sure I would funnel that kid into alternative assessment, but technically a student could take just an SAT or just a PSAT or ACT or ASVAB, achieve the score, and be eligible to graduate. A student who has more than one area in which they are not proficient through the Keystone would have to take an AP or IB course and exam in each of those content areas. So for example, if I was proficient in English literature and biology, but not algebra, I would have to take an AP or IB math course. If I were only proficient in algebra, I would have to take 2 AP or IB courses, one in literature and one in science. The AP score is 3 or higher. The IB score is 4 or higher in that particular content area.
Brian,
Yes.
I'm sorry, don't mean to interrupt again, but we have Mary Margaret says, am I correct that an SAT score of 1010 satisfies lit and algebra, but not bio since science is not tested?
That is actually not so. Even though
Yeah.
science is not tested, the way the law is written, a student could satisfy any of the requirements and or all of the 3 testing requirements by achieving the 1010 or higher. So
Thank
a
you.
student, yeah, in my example, you could be proficient in only algebra, pass the trigger course for biology and literature, and achieve a 1010 and graduate, even though science is not technically on the test. The evidence-based pathway is the final pathway, okay? And again, not, to sound like a broken record, but we need that successful completion in the trigger course for which the student was not proficient, and 3 pieces of information, 3 of the following pieces of evidence or artifacts. This is very much if you want to think of it as sort of a portfolio approach to graduation. This is looking at a student's gathering these artifacts and gathering evidence that demonstrates preparedness for either post-secondary learning or a move directly to the military or to the workforce. And what you've got is sort of a checklist of acceptable evidence at this point. And again, this makes my slide very busy, and I apologize. This is quite a long list to just simply bullet up there. And we're going to talk about the toolkit and some of the tracking tools in a minute so that you would have a better handle on this. But for the sake of demonstration, up there are some of the things that would qualify. The student would have to have at least one piece of evidence from that first section, which is an established score on an alternate assessment, acceptance to an other than a 4-year accredited nonprofit institution, attainment of the industry recognized credential, or successful completion of a concurrent enrollment or post-secondary course. So a student needs one of those. Now you'll notice that there's an established test score there, and you're going to say, well, that's why if the student achieved a certain test score, they would have graduated in the alternative assessment pathway. Because you are augmenting that test score with some additional evidence in the evidence-based pathway, those cut scores are different. So the scores are different for students in the evidence-based pathway. In many instances, they are slightly lower because the student is going to augment that score with some additional evidence. So a student needs one piece of evidence from that top list, at least one from the top list, and then at least 2 more from either the top or the bottom there. And that would be completion of a service learning project, proficient or advanced on a Keystone exam, a letter guaranteeing full-time employment, internship or cooperative education program, compliance with the NCAA clearinghouse, again, acceptance to a other than a 4-year accredited college, the industry credential, or successfully complete the concurrent enrollment course.
Brian,
Yes.
again, a question from Tracy. She
Okay.
says repeat test takers will receive a non-numeric proficient, yet are not exempt from accountability. This was in a PowerPoint from DQN training in January. What accountability is that referring to? Participation rate for that group of students, perhaps?
Yeah, most likely participation rate. So the important thing to know is that state accountability was waived under Act 136. So there is no student data included in teacher evaluation. So that has been waived. We have filed, PDE has filed what is called the US addendum waiver, which would exempt us from including those scores in identification for things like for school improvement, for CSI, ATSI, and TSI, and things like that. At this point, USD has not approved those waivers. We're not at the deadline. There's no reason to expect they won't. But at the moment, our assumption is that we will not be identifying schools next year. So that form of accountability is waived. What is not clear through the addendum waiver is things like participation rate and primary participation rate needing to take the exam. So that may or may not necessarily be waived. It's also important to understand at the moment that non-numeric proficient would prevent a student, the composite score pathway then is not available to that student because you do need a numeric score in all three keystones to build a composite. And there are other reasons actually why a student might not have 3 scores for a composite. The religious opt-out, the English language learner who doesn't take the first year ELA test, students who move in from other states. There are a lot of reasons why that could happen. That was a good question, thank you. We said in this pathway, the approved assessment scores were potentially lower. And you would see the ACT Work Keys score is silver level, not gold. The gold level, I believe, is a 4 on each of the 3 core tests. I believe the silver level is 3 on each of the core tests. The SAT subject test, which by the way is being discontinued, but the score is determined because there are a handful of students who will still have this as they come through. And there are some states that issue still the SAT subject test as part of their accountability system. That's a 630. Now that is not the 2 tests that make up the overall SAT. The SAT subject test is an SAT in one of the areas that's not on there. There's actually an SAT developed in world history, some world languages, things like that. So it's a 630 on that test. And you'll see that the AP score and IB score are now 3 or higher. The AP remains 3, but the IB score drops to 3 in the alternate, or excuse me, in the evidence-based pathway. Again, because we know that student's going to do additional things inside of that portfolio to achieve that score.
Brian?
Yes.
We have a question from Heather. She says, I thought you had to be a first-time test taker to receive the non-numeric proficient score.
You do. So it was any student who was in the 1920 cohort that was exempted from testing by the USDE waiver and would have been a first-time test taker. So if you had taken a trigger course and taken a keystone in 1819 and were retesting simply because you weren't proficient, needed a higher score for whatever reason, and your retest was waived, we aren't necessarily taking your score off the board, so to speak. So that student does have an established numerical score. So it would only be the students who were first-time test takers and simply did not have the opportunity to take the test because USDE waived the exam. And those students are being identified in PIMS right now through a PIMS pool that a lot of the folks probably listening to me are participating in or have already participated. One thing that is coming literally any day now. In fact, we do have a handout that's a small piece of this, and a very small piece of this. This is actually a very dense kind of interactive toolkit that is going to be available both on the SAS website and the PDE website. We hope to have more of it to give you today. It's undergoing literally the last phases of ADA compliance and the handful of things that have to happen to get posted digitally. And that's the Act 158 toolkit. And you know, at PDE, we're committed to really pushing out some tools. We understand that while none of these things are new, and while, you know, we're asking you to collect a lot of things that very much benefit kids and are a much more authentic, probably, representation of a student's preparedness for post-secondary careers and things like that, we've also created an accounting issue that you didn't have before. There's no doubt. So we want to look at some tools that will help schools not only internally be able to comply with the reporting requirements and things, but also help you when you, as a teacher or an administrator or a school counselor, sit down with a kid and help this kid self-select a pathway to graduation and something that matches, you know, what the student has going on and what the student is preparing for in their post-secondary or career goals. We want to give you tools to be able to, again, help students, help parents, help other folks self-select these pathways and work through the proper pathway so that students are meeting their graduation goals on time. Some of the things in there, you know, some LEA planning and preparation tools, again, some guidance to serve our special population, understanding of that superintendent's waiver and how to apply that group of students, glossaries and guidance and resources, obviously, FAQs. We've got even some things like sample scenarios and things that we'll use in training that'll help you be able to sort kids quickly through the pathways. And then some tracking and reporting tools that we hope will help you, again, sort these kids and be able to track their progress on the pathways as they move through. The big question around the data summit for a lot of you, I'm sure, is again, we talked about not just knowing what to do with the pathways and not just helping our students graduate and meet their goals, but the requirements, the reporting. There is reporting requirements established by Act 158. The reporting will be done in the comprehensive plan portal that is being established, that about a third of you probably have worked through your comprehensive plan in this. The folks coming up on a plan this year, the second cohort, or I think it's called WAVE or Window, whatever they're called in comprehensive planning, that group will go through soon. The reason we did not put this in PIMS is because this is aggregate information. We are not collecting individual student information. So that's not tied to PIMS. It's going to be available to you inside the comprehensive plan portal. The law establishes that annual reporting is due no later than December 1st of each year, beginning in 2023. Okay, so the class that graduates hopefully in May or June of 2023, current 10th graders that you certify in October as graduates, you will then report in December. What exactly do you have to report? And this is going to be important for you to know exactly what you are keeping track of and responsible to get back to us. You're going to first look at the total number of students enrolled in 12th grade and the number that graduated within that prior school year. And we'll give you some help with that number through PIMS and through the number that we're using as your student cohort. And you'll have to know how many of those students didn't graduate. You also have to know the number of students inside that cohort that were granted a waiver or graduated through achieving the goals of their IEP. Because remember, those students are not technically in a pathway. They're really, in the long run, 7 ways to graduate, I guess. And if we're going to look at the number of graduates and then the number of non-graduates, then we have to sort each of these folks into a pathway. So we've got the students who were granted a waiver and the number of students who graduated by achieving the IEP goals. Then for the students in the pathway, you need the number of students inside each pathway, and then the number of students that utilized each option under the pathway. Therefore, you need the number of students who took an SAT, the number of students who took an ASVAB, the number of students who were accepted into the four-year institution, number of students, whichever of those sub kind of bullets you're using as graduation that a student used, the student used to meet graduation.
Brian?
You are not, oh, yep, go ahead, Jean.
I'm sorry. I
Yep.
didn't mean to interrupt. There's
No.
been a bit of conversation. This is really an easy question about when you talk about the comprehensive planning portal, are you talking about the old one, the new one, the one that's named Future Ready Comprehensive
Yeah.
Planning Portal, or can you clarify?
Yeah, no, and I appreciate that. I probably wasn't specific enough. It is the new one that is named the Future Ready Comprehensive Portal.
Thank you.
That is, yep, that is correct. The other thing I wanted to kind of point out as we talk about number of students and talk about reporting in aggregate here. So externally, you are not reporting to each to PDE maybe each student's test score or each student's SAT score. You're not reporting to PDE. You're not submitting to us each full-time letter of employment and things like that. Certainly internally, those are things you want to have, and you want to have an internal system to track and gather that information in case there is an audit. And there could be an audit either sprung by using the waiver, too many times in consecutive years over the 5%, or through any of the regular Chapter 4 requirements that would require an audit. So those are things certainly you want to have internally, whether you do that through kids transcript or through their internal file folders, or you build an information system inside your SIS. Those are all options. That's just accounting that needs to be done internally. Externally, you're going to report in aggregate the number of students who use both the pathway and then the evidence inside of each of those pathways. Which kind of brings us to the organizational discussion, the moving forward slide. So what are some things you need to do to prepare? Act 136 has delayed the requirement to 2023. We're looking at current 10th graders. So what are some things we can start doing so that by December 1st of 2023, you're able to easily submit to us this information and easily certify your graduates that October? We want to look internally at some policies and protocols. So establishing some roles inside of your LEA, how the teacher interacts with this system, how the school counselors and school administrators are going to interact, who's keeping track of what's the collection system. So that's the first kind of step, is internally what policies and protocols you are going to have, what roles you're going to define, and the way that folks are going to work cooperatively to track this information, not just for reporting, but also, like we said, to be able to conference with students and work with students, parents and families and community and caregivers, so that you can again help students self-select on the right pathway and meet the pathway goal. You're also going to want to consider in this space some stakeholder communication. Most likely, this is a change from your locally established pathway or locally established graduation policy. Most of those, again, kind of heavily relied on keystones and things like credits and required courses and things like that. You are still, as a local LEA, allowed to establish a credit limit or those kind of different things. The credits are not statewide mandated. They're not part of Chapter 4. Those are local sort of policies. But you do have to, when folks will say, do we have to offer the pathways? Yes, you have to offer pathways. You have to accept evidence in each pathway. That does not mean you have to schedule a school-wide SAT for every student or a school-wide ASVAB for every student or things like that. It can be on the student to pick up the options, but a student has to be able to submit the option if it's available. So again, you're going to need to communicate some things to your stakeholders probably about the difference in state graduation pathways and how some of this is going to take effect and when and things like that. Another thing you want to look at internally are any articulation agreements or community partnerships you may have. Things like a enrollment in a concurrent course, satisfies some of the pathway requirements, an established internship program, some of those type of things. If you haven't got those, there's some time to maybe look at those and put them in place. But the other thing to look at is if you've got an internship or a community service project or things like that, just kind of looking at the requirements as far as hours and certifications and things, and just making sure what you're offering counts. You may very well offer some of these things that with very slight modification, you do make these options or these pieces of evidence available to all your students. So just sort of looking at any articulation agreements, community partnerships, cooperative job experiences, work-based learning opportunities, taking a look at what you've got on the books and how those things can be offered to your kids that are going to select into these pathways.
Brian, 15-minute warning.
Okay, thank you. Any operational discussions? Again, we're looking at a tracking tool that would help you inside of that toolkit. And that's something you may already also establish or have established, even if it's as simple as, sometimes an Excel spreadsheet or a Google sheet that folks can get in and track some of this evidence all the way up to there are some very sophisticated things you may want to do. You also want to have a discussion with your SIS vendor. PDE is having those discussions overall so that they're aware of the requirements and what we're asking you to do and aware of the rules and pieces of evidence. But again, remember, these are vendors. So while we can make them aware and make suggestions, we can't enforce certain changes. So you need to work with your SIS vendor and find out what's possible inside of your SIS, what your information system may already track, and some things that you might be able to take advantage of there. We are pushing out some virtual training. There will be 3 modules. These we hope to look at in late summer and early fall, some of the trainings. And those trainings, one, start with some of the resources that PDE has made available and the tools. 2, the implementation of Act 158 and of the pathways, and then a specific module on tracking and reporting. And this way, again, some of the established roles, then hopefully inside your LEA, maybe folks won't have to look at all 3 and you'll have a team members available to participate in each.
Brian?
Yep.
Just a point of clarification from Laurie, and she says, to clarify, a school can keep credit minimums as part of local graduation requirements, but all students must graduate through one of the pathways, not local graduation requirements.
That is true. However, the credit requirement could be part of your locally grade-based minimums to allow the student in. So there are local policies that can exist on top of the pathways. The pathways are a minimum.